Do you struggle with the London system? Well, look no further because today I'm going to be teaching you guys a way for Black to play against the London system. And this can be played whether you're a beginner or a title player. It's a very aggressive yet very solid way to play against the London and takes most London players out of their preparation. So let's get started. In this instance, I would like to start with knight f6. So if you guys play d5, I strongly suggest you switch over to knight f6 because most of the openings you play likely can transpose and can be just started with knight f6. Knight f6 is more flexible because you're not committing anything and right away, your opponent doesn't know what you're planning. For example, here you could play a King's Indian, a Grunfeld, a Slav, a Queen's Gambit Decline. So I strongly suggest you guys start with knight f6. After bishop f4, the move which we will be focusing on today is c5. c5 is ultra aggressive. It challenges the center right away. And there are plenty of other YouTube videos which cover this c5 move. However, they all cover specific sidelines or they just don't go as in depth as I would like to. So I feel like this video will be useful for a lot of players, and I hope you guys find this informative. So today we're going to be covering 5 moves. D takes c5, this is going to be the first move because it's the most forcing. c3, e3, knight f3, and d5. Let's start with D takes c5. So right away we have 2 options. We can play queen a5 check and just immediately recapture the pawn. However, I see this position as slightly inferior to the move knight a6, because knight a6 allows you to bring your knight into the game. The knight on c5 is slightly better than the queen on c5. And therefore, I see this as slightly more preferable. If your opponent decides to not defend this pawn and play something like knight f3, you just recapture the pawn and now you're slightly better. You're going to follow up with e6 and d5 and you're going to have a very solid center. You could also start with d6 and then play e5. And this would be a little bit more aggressive. And then you would have to worry about protecting this d6 pawn, which wouldn't be too hard, I would imagine. But once again, very much up to you. Let's move 4 and you're already slightly better. So what more could you ask for? Let's cover what happens now if white decides to actually defend this pawn with queen d4. So after queen d4, you play queen a5 check. This is the main move. Here, your opponent can play knight c3, knight d2. Most opponents are going to play c3. This is sort of in the spirit of the London system because you want to play c3 and e3 and then develop your knight through d2. Either one really doesn't matter. You're just going to capture this pawn with your queen. And after this trade occurs, once again, you're going to be better. If your opponent decides not to trade queens, which would be the wiser choice, and play something like e3, let's say, in order to, for example, if this trade was to occur, to create a very solid pawn structure, you can play a very simple g6. And g6 is just preparing to fianchetto this bishop. You're also going to open up an extra in the queen. For long-term prospects, this bishop is going to be pretty strong. Even though there's a pawn on c3, it can be undermined with moves like b5 and b4. Which would allow this bishop to become stronger as time goes on. If you don't want to play g6, if you want to play a little differently, you could also start with d6 and prepare e5. An example of that line would be something as like this, which would force white into a pretty passive position and you would look pretty good here. I don't really advocate for this just because of this d6 pawn, which is a long-term target. However, you do have a bishop which protects it, so you could play bishop e7 in castle and you would be completely fine and you would be better. However, I believe that g6 is just a slightly more safer and more solid option, which will serve you well. However, it is up to you. Knight f3, bishop g7. Here, a very common idea is to take this knight in order to undermine and ruin your pawn structure. If that happens, just trade the queens off, take this bishop. It may seem momentarily that white is a little bit better. However, that is absolutely not the case. You have bishop b7. You're going to target this knight, ruin white's pawn structure. That really covers everything to do with d takes c5. It's not a very theoretically heavy line. You just have to remember knight a6, and then you have to basically play on principle and remember this g6 move or the d6 e5 push. Let's move on to line 2. This is the most popular variation, which is e3. This is very logical. You're supporting this pawn. Here in recent times, a lot of people have been playing c takes d5. It has scored okay. It's not been like some sort of breakthrough or novelty. So if you want to, you can take more time to study that. I personally don't like that. I feel like queen b6 immediately is the better option. So we play queen b6. Very logical continuation. You're aiming at this pawn. Now here, there's a very, very tricky kind of trappy line, I guess you could say, which is knight c3. You can take on b2. I'd only recommend this to someone who's playing in an on-the-board tournament whose opponent is perhaps a couple hundred points rated higher than them, because this variation can lead to a very quick draw or a very complicated position. But basically, point is knight b5. Now, knight b5 threatens this c7 square, so a very nice move is knight d5 here. This attacks this bishop on f4, and it also protects c7. And then you get hit with rook b1. Now your queen is kind of in a stalemate position. Basically, we take this pawn, and then white can just repeat moves. And the thing is, you don't have any way to escape with the queen, but there's also no way to trap the queen. So this can lead to a very quick draw. Alternatively, your opponent might just put your queen on the side of the board and then play something like bishop g3, and now the game continues, and it gets very complicated from here. You can play like knight c6, and then play knight b4 and try to attack white. The move I recommend instead of taking the pawn when knight c3 is played is d6. D6 is a move that we always want to play in this line because first and foremost, what are we trying to achieve? Well, this bishop has come out to f4 in order to play an active role in suppressing our pieces. So by playing d6, this bishop is now staring at our pawn, which makes the bishop a lot worse and makes us a lot happier. This just makes the position very solid. Now, obviously, this also opens up the light square bishop, and this makes the dark square bishop very difficult to develop. So oftentimes, we're going to play g6 and bishop g7 in these variations. Knight f3 gets played. So what we can notice is that we can pin this knight to the queen. However, it's something that I would advise against because there's a very nice resource for white, which is bishop b5 check, which applies pressure. Obviously, we do not want to block with the knight because we want to be able to move the knight. And now on c6, when it's pinned by the bishop, it's just a little bit dangerous. There's ideas like, let me just show you guys what I mean. After bishop b5, knight c6, there's d5 ideas in the future. I'll steer away from this particular variation. So you keep this bishop on c8 until you've castled, and then you can bring it out wherever you like. Here I just like g6. I can play bishop d3. We can play bishop g7, castles. Now this bishop can come out wherever you'd like. If h3 gets played, which prevents bishop g4, I strongly suggest you play c takes d4. The point is that if this knight recaptures, you have this nice move e5, which forks these pieces and you win the game. If this does not happen, after pawn takes, you simply have knight c6, and now you're in a very equal middle game. So white has not been able to obtain any advantage. In fact, white has lost all of their opening advantage. If something like d5 gets played, you have knight b4, attacking both of these pieces, and you're going to be completely fine. This position is very easy to play as black, and is very difficult to navigate as white. You simply want to develop this bishop somewhere, place a rook in the center, another rook in the center. Maybe a pawn break with e5 at some point will be possible. And then you want to find a way to attack this pawn. If somehow white manages to play c3, we can start a minority attack right away with like b5 and a5, b4 ideas. So you can move your queen, rook b8, and right away start pushing pawns. This is absolutely an option. This is something you can do. If you don't know what a minority attack is or how to employ properly, I have made a specific dedicated video to the minority attack. You will be able to find it in the link above me. I'd strongly suggest you watch it after this video if you have not yet watched it. That really covers everything to do with e3. I feel like obviously your opponent can play something different after queen b6, for example, just a random move like bishop d3. In which case, once again, you have to figure out what you would like to do. In this particular instance, you can take this pawn. It's impossible for me to cover every single move. I'm just trying to cover the best, most playable moves. Now it's time to cover move 3, which is d5. So d5, the point is that white wants to take up as much space as possible. White wants to release the tension from the center and then play e4, maybe f3, take as much space as possible, put you in a very awkward position. We play d6. This is something I've shown you guys in every single line that we've covered so far, just because d6 is a very helpful move. Knight c3, you can also get knight f3. It really doesn't matter. The move order does not change. And we play e5. Now e5 is a very interesting move. So if white decides to move this bishop elsewhere, let's say attacks our knight or just moves back, what ends up happening is that we've taken up as much space as we possibly could, and now we're in a very nice position. Now white also has en passant. En passant is the main move in this position. Let's cover that first. So if en passant gets played, we can play bishop takes e6. There's a couple of things to note here. So for one, we have a backward pawn on d6. This implies that this pawn is weak and it's a target. However, we also have a bunch of pieces protecting it, so it's not really a target at the moment. And the second thing is that we are far more developed. We have all of these pawns already developed, and we're ready to play knight c6, bishop e7, and castle very shortly. White has to play 3 full moves where they have the option to castle kingside. And white does not want to castle queenside, usually in these positions. The reason for that is that black has a lot of attacking chances with b5, b4, a5, a4, a3. This is something that we employ anyway, so obviously if white was to castle queenside, we would have a field day attacking white with all these pawns. f3, knight c6, e4, putting a pawn in the center. We play bishop e7. We do not want to feint ghetto the bishop in this position because otherwise this pawn on d6 would become a real big target and then we would have a very difficult time defending it. So it's better to keep the bishop defending this pawn for the meantime. Bishop d3, and we castle. Now we've secured a safe king, white has castled, and then we play d5. We do not want to allow this pawn to stay on e4 and a pawn on d6, because once again, this pawn on d6 is a long-term weakness, so we want to get rid of that. If this trade occurs, we're pretty happy because we have very nice piece development, and this position is pretty much equal. Our queen is out, and I let my computer run in this position for a couple of hours, and I had Stockfish 16, and it led to a 45 depth variation, which I am going to show you guys sort of the plans and ideas in this structure. So after rook e1, for example, you're going to play bishop f6, bishop e4, queen trade occurs. I really skipped over most of these moves because they were in theory, and it's very unlikely that you're going to face these specific moves in that order. So the point of that was just to showcase what you were going to encounter. And what you're going to encounter is a bishop and rook endgame in most of these cases. So that is something you should be prepared for. If you don't know your bishop and rook endgames very well, maybe do a few puzzles related to those and see how well you fare in that position. And yeah, this is completely equal. This is a very drawish positions. However, if you're not an engine, it's very likely that you'll be able to accumulate some sort of attacking chances, and you might be able to gain an advantage and actually win the game. If you're a title player, probably a draw. If you're not, you have every opportunity to win this game. Now, what happens if white doesn't take out passant, and let's say the bishop retreats to g3? In that particular case, we can quickly develop with a6. The point of a6 is they're going to be playing b5 and b4 as illustrated with these arrows. You want to kick this knight out, and then you want to target this pawn or the e4 pawn. Let me show you guys an example. e4 is probably going to be the move you're going to face the most. e4 is obviously the most natural move. It puts the pawn in the center and supports this d4 pawn. You immediately play b5, bishop d3, kicking this bishop out, b4, forcing this knight to move somewhere. If knight a4, for example, you have bishop d7 right away, and then you can just take this pawn. You can also start by taking this pawn. That's also completely fine. And then you still capture this pawn. So very nice position. You would be up an entire pawn. Obviously, that's not the end of the game. You still have to be very accurate. So the plans for that position, you would usually trade this knight off and then play knight e7, knight b6. You can play bishop e7 and castle. There is a way that white can avoid this by playing, instead of bishop d3, for example, white can play f3. This prevents this from happening. In this case, we're just going to be very solid. We're going to play knight e7. One thing you can notice is that this d6 pawn is almost untargetable. So we're going to play g6 and attempt to develop this bishop through bishop h6, point being that we will survey this whole diagonal. And also, if we're able to trade off this dark square bishop, because right now it's obviously our weakest piece. Obviously, white can start with like bishop g5. It's impossible to prepare a line for every single move. You can also start with a6, and you're going to be very much in the same situation. You might want to place the bishop on e7 in this instance just to avoid any unnecessary complications. So you don't always have to play g6 and play bishop h6. And that's pretty much that. Let's move on to move 4. So a move 4 would be a knight f3. It's a very flexible move. White doesn't really commit any pawns anywhere. White's kind of just seeing what's up. We're not going to waste any time. We're going to take this pawn right away. There's no point in developing the queen when we can just take this pawn. And the reason for that is because white doesn't have any very good ways to recapture. For example, if this knight captures, it's actually a blunder, and right away you play e5. And you realize that this is a fork, but you might also see that white can just take this pawn, right? Not exactly, because we play queen a5 check, and now we win this bishop, and hopefully win the game. If white captures the queen, we have so many good options. I mean, this is already slightly better for black. If the queen recaptures, obviously we can play knight c6 and kick the queen away, which would leave us with a much better position because we traded off white's center pawn for a c pawn, and we have very good development. However, I really like the move d6 to start out with because, well, this also kicks the queen out. For example, if e3 gets played, you just play e5, and now once again you win a piece. This time it's not so pretty. You end up losing 2 pawns. However, you're still up a piece, so it's obviously preferable to be up a piece than to not be up a piece. If this knight captures, we recapture back. White has a couple of options. White can take away a right to castle, but by doing so, white also eliminates any chance of counterplay. The reason for that is whenever you have a lot of pieces, generally speaking, if you're down material, you never want to trade because the more you trade, the less counterplay you have. It's harder to create an attack when you have few pieces on the board. And by trading off the queen, white gets rid of their main attacker. White can choose to not trade and just like queen takes a pawn. In that case, we play bishop e7, and I'd say we're a lot happier here because we can just very easily castle, and even then, white still has no counterplay. Can also kick the queen out with knight c6. So this d6 line, I guarantee you somebody is going to, first of all, take with the knight, and you're going to win the game. I can also guarantee that someone is going to play queen d4 and just miscalculate and lose a piece. Now, if white can see a move into the future, it's very likely that white's going to move their queen somewhere. White can play queen h4 check. In that case, we play bishop d7, kicking the queen out once again, and also developing a piece. So I'd say that's a win-win situation for us. If white decides to put the queen on d2, we can develop with knight c6. And we're a little bit better because we have e5 coming, and that's going to be very annoying for white to deal with. Last but not least, let's cover c3. So c3 is an interesting move. It's different from the other moves because it allows this queen to come out with the b3. So we're going to play queen b6, queen b3. That's the whole idea of playing c3. And now we just take this pawn. White captures our queen, we recapture back. If you're familiar with the London and playing queen b6, this is something you should be sort of familiar with because it's a very common idea. You get double pawns, but you open up your rook. White recaptures the pawn, we play knight c6. White has to defend this pawn somehow, so let's say e3 first. Knight b4 is the idea. You want to play knight c2 and fork the king and queen. There's only one good way to defend against this, and it's to play king d1. There's also knight a3. In this case, we sacrifice our rook, ruin white's pawn structure, and then still play knight c2. After this exchange occurs, it's safe to say that we're a little bit better just because White's going to have to spend a lot of time recapturing this knight. Our knight, actually, it's very unlikely that it's going to be able to escape. Generally speaking, we're going to play something like e6 and try to just win this pawn and be up an entire pawn. And afterwards, we're going to play like d5 and put this bishop out to d7 and then place on a4, for example. The way we have to deal with these double pawns is we're going to move one of these pawns up at some point, and then we're going to try to place a piece on c4. c4 is a very nice outpost square for any of our pieces, and if it ever gets traded off, we're always going to recapture the b pawn and undouble our pawns. So if king c1, for example, you have knight e4 right away jumping in, preparing knight f2, which would trap the rook, knight h3 and d5. This opens up this attack. White can very easily mess up here. Let's say white plays king b1. We take this knight, ruin white's pawn structure, then take this pawn, attacking this rook and the pawn. White's only way to protect the rook is to go rook b1. And here we just continue with our normal development. Now we're just up a pawn. We're about to be up 2 pawns, and we're very happy in that position. If white plays f3, you have very complicated moves involving like e5. That's what the engine suggests. I say you can always just bring your knight back, and you're going to be completely fine in that case as well. But the good thing to know is that you have a bunch of options. You can even play g5. Knight f6 works fine, and then e6 and taking this pawn. So if you get into this particular variation, I'd say not to worry too much. Just retreat the knight, and you're going to be fine. Now let's briefly look over knight f3. So if knight f3 gets played after knight c6, we're going to do the exact same thing with knight b4. Here, knight a3 is even worse, because after all of this, we're actually able to retreat the knight in a lot of variations. Pursuing the knight is very difficult, and once again, we have this knight e4 idea. Now, if that does not happen and white plays the best defensive move, which is king d1, and by the way, I didn't mention this in the e3 variation because the line is like exactly the same. You just play knight e4. Now you're attacking this check. White really only has 2 ways to defend it, bishop e3 and bishop g3. If bishop g3 right away, you can actually take this bishop, and that's fine as well. You do have the bishop here, so there is an argument to be made that you are better. The engine evaluates this as equal or slightly better for white, but playing this as a human being is really all that matters, and if you think this is a comfortable position for you, then definitely go for it. It's very easy to play. Now, there's recently been a game between Grandmaster and an International Master during Title Tuesday, which involved the move bishop e3. After bishop e3, you simply retreat with knight d5. Now you're attacking this bishop and threatening to ruin white's pawn structure, and that's exactly what happened in the game. And in that case, it's obvious that black is better. For example, you play d5, you develop this bishop, you play e6, bring your other bishop out, and castle. The plans and ideas are very simple. You're going to play b4, rook c8. You're going to be winning these games. That summarizes absolutely everything I wanted to show you guys for this video on how to beat the London system. I hope you found this informative, and if you did, please consider checking out a video to my left. As always, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in a future video.